tell her on the phone how to write code. I'm like, function, Fibonacci, bracket, open braces.
Oh my gosh.
Go to an event and find out who are the good people out there who may not be obviously on LinkedIn as well. So
I wanted to know from your perspective, does that actually make a person stand out, that this person does side projects related to their work outside work, or do you think that's not really necessary? You should also have a life, maybe. Hello everyone, welcome to RedTech. I'm Saloni, a software developer.
I'm Natasha, also a software developer.
And today we have Joanna, a recruiter, and today's episode is going to be all about recruitment.
hi, I'm Joanna. I'm a talent acquisition manager.
So perhaps to start off, Joanna, would you like to tell us about what a talent acquisition manager is and what your role is?
Yep. So maybe I can start off. So basically, I am working for a venture capital firm, and I have been a talent acquisition manager for the last 3 years. And before that, I was doing recruitment for about close 5 years. So in total, about 8 years. So what a talent acquisition manager does is not just on recruiting. It can be a lot more than recruiting.
Right.
So first, of course, when you want to do recruitment, you need to do sourcing. So you need to find good candidates for the role. And also, secondly, you will actually need to do a lot of the back end work. So it's not just the front end work where you do all the calling of the candidates, finding the right candidate, but you actually need to transpose them into informations where you can actually present them to your hiring managers as well as for your managers as well to understand what the recruitment process look like.
Right. So just to clarify, the hiring manager and the talent acquisition specialist is different.
Yes, it is actually different.
Okay.
So a lot of time people have mistakenly, used both these words
Interchangeably, right?
correct.
Yeah.
Because a lot of time they think that recruiters are basically doing recruiting only. The word it's basically recruitment, right? But actually as a talent acquisition, what it means, if you break down, it's talent acquire, right? So meaning you need to acquire good talent, but in order to do that, you need to actually look at all different segment of it.
Right.
So not just on finding candidates where it's an external agency, you just look for good candidates. Whereas for internal roles, you actually do a lot more towards, finding candidates, making sure that they fit the cultural fit, and also understanding what the requirements are as a firm and the business
Right.
needs. So it's a
Okay.
lot more than hiring and also just looking at,
And
the
like
right
doing
candidate.
interviews and stuff like that.
Yes,
So
correct.
if you're talking about acquisition, would you say that you will be the first bar, like that first round where people send in like their CVs and stuff like that? You're the one who like filters that.
Yes, correct. So I do all the filtering of the candidates. So I do global recruiting actually. So my role here, it's not just, looking at candidates that apply from the website. So typically our recruitments, right? If you were to have a new role, you will actually advertise it externally.
Yeah.
But we don't actually only post it there, but we actually do a lot of outreach to candidates. So a lot of cold reaching out of candidates, doing a lot of finding out, if there's any events related to this role. Yeah, how can you actually look into that? Go to an event and find out who are the good people out there who may not be obviously on LinkedIn as well. So you actually have to do that as well. So the role is quite varied. But I
Right.
think the good thing about what we do here is basically finding the best candidate as well, best talent that fits into the company's culture as well. So that's something that I do a lot as well.
Right. Because in your role, you're not just doing internal recruitment, you're also recruiting for the portfolio companies under your larger company. So that's why it's more of like you also have to match
Correct.
the company values to the candidate. So when it comes to like really looking at a candidate, we're not just like looking at pure credentials, right?
Yes.
Yeah, you're looking at things like alignment to company values, which I've always found is kind of vague if you think about it. And
Yeah.
how do you do that? Because first you need to understand the company values. Then second, you have to somehow be able to identify these values at the first cut, at the second cut. Like how do you do this? Like such a vague and complex term.
So for me, I think what's important is for the first cut, you actually need to, I mean, before that even that process can happen, you need to actually sit down with the hiring managers to actually understand what this role looks like first, right? Because ultimately, there are two ways as well to do it. It doesn't mean that all recruiters have to sit into all first round interviews. Not necessary. There are times where there are hiring managers led recruitment, and there are times that we do it as a recruiter led interviews. So meaning that if we are doing recruiter-led interviews, means that we are the first person that they do meet as an initial round to actually test out and understand basically what the requirements are for this role, and all the way up to say, some technical questions as well. We're not technical, I have to say, but we do actually implement, or rather get a gist of what the jargons are for the specific role, and we actually integrate or improvise that into our interview questions as well. So every role is different. Yeah. So if, let's say, I were to do the first round, I would typically try to figure out what this role looks like first with the hiring manager, and break it down into two parts and understand what is required as a recruiter to engage with these candidates about before I move them to the next round. So that's basically what I do here.
Yeah, yeah. That's interesting because you brought up the term jargon and having to understand the role with the hiring managers first. And I think because like Saloni and I, we're software engineers, and obviously there's a lot of jargon. Yeah. I mean, like Saloni would have more experience at recruiting than I would. So
I actually remember this one time I spoke to a recruiter, a tech recruiter. I mean, tech recruiter as in she was recruiting me as a software developer, so tech recruiter. But so she had no technical knowledge, but she actually did ask me a technical question at the end of the first round of interview, which was just a HR phone call. So she did ask me actually, how would you implement the Fibonacci?
Oh, she asked that.
Yeah, the Fibonacci program, and she asked me on the phone. So I'm actually supposed to tell her on the phone how to write code. So I'm like, function Fibonacci bracket open braces.
Oh my gosh.
I'm like, is that the level? Because I didn't know how do I do this with you who doesn't understand what I'm saying.
It's true.
So, and I don't know what is she writing what I'm saying, or it was a bit weird, but it was like 5 to 6 lines of code that I told her. She even asked me, is it recursive or is it not? She knew that much. So and then at the end of it, I did ask her, sorry, that was new to me, like saying out code on the phone. Did you understand it? Or she's like, no, I just have to relay this information back to the hiring manager. So I got what I wanted. She did ask me the recursive, non-recursive. Like she knew some jargons. I don't know if she knew what it meant, but she noted down things. It was new to me, but I think I was like in awe of it, because that actually makes sense, because she did say that it's because a lot of people apply to us, and a lot of them, I realized at the second round, at the coding round, that they don't know how to code. Then you're wasting the interviewer's time.
Correct.
So therefore, she did the first level of filtering by asking this question, and if you knew how to code, you would be able to answer something.
Exactly.
So then I was like, wow, okay. So someone actually like told her to like ask this question to filter out people. So I understand what you mean by you will understand like the criteria and then try to filter as much as possible at your level.
Yes.
But I'm guessing as a general general recruiter, you would know about so many different roles in your firm, right? So not just tech. You would also have product management,
UX UI designer.
there will be different kinds of filtering for each of the different departments.
Exactly.
I would say. So would you have to like learn?
Yeah, actually,
would you do side by side maybe?
yes, that's a very good question actually. So because I'm a generalist in where I am right now, so I typically do all kinds of roles. I could do anything from a business development role to a sales role to an operations role, a legal role, could be anything, right? But if you're talking about UI UX, and previously I was looking for a full stack developer, that's actually very different as well, right? So if you were to look at recruiting, right, like what you've just mentioned earlier, it's actually very similar to my experience, because I am not a technical person. I was not brought up in that environment. But of course, I did expose myself into that space, which is why I had some experience understanding it. But before I can get into that, I also want to maybe break down as well on two parts. I think when you mentioned earlier, right, about your experience speaking to a recruiter, that's something that I need to do as well. So, of course, I would say that when it comes to technical recruiting, or rather your product management or your UI UX designers, you typically get a ton of candidates. Whereas for a technical role, a very, very technical role where you talk about full stack developers, your software engineers, I don't see that demand in that space.
Oh, okay,
Yeah.
okay.
So if you look into two parts, right? Actually, UI, UX, and product management roles are more simplified. You don't actually have to go into all the jargons, the technical front of it. Like, what do you build? You don't actually need to go into that space, but you do actually need to understand what are some of the projects that you have covered, you have done. Whereas on the part where you're looking at software engineers and all that, you basically have to ask questions like that. Whereas we don't understand, right? But what I do is before I do this call with a candidate, I do the intake call with the hiring managers. I say, show me how do you do this and what do you do with that. So that's how I actually gain insights into how this role would look like. And when candidate asks me, how is this going to translate into their career trajectory, that's something that I would actually speak about as well. So it's quite interesting that when as a recruiter that doesn't have technical experience, we don't actually just sit on it and say, hey, let's just figure out ourselves, but we actually do ask a lot of these questions to the hiring managers and say, look, let me understand, help me understand in a way actually, how do I actually speak to these candidates and understand what this project looks like, what is the end goal of it, and what's the objective of this. Yeah, so the recruiting exercise is pretty lengthy. So if you were to look at, I mean, going back to, like recruiting in technical roles, I typically don't see a lot of candidates applying. So typically we have like less than 100 applicants that comes in to our system. But what we do is we do a lot of outreach because it's so specialized into the technical experience skill set. We do work with the hiring managers to figure out what is required for the role. Then we'll actually reach out to them and speak to them about that. So that will take a lot of our time off, from interviewing candidates to the part where they move on to the coding exercise. So the coding exercise is all curated and created based on what the role requirements are. So it's very different from what you may have experienced in your corporate role or even in, your other roles, right? So I think that's something that we do typically see that it's a good challenge to understand if they're a right fit. So we spend like hours, creating this projects, this use cases as well that would make sense for candidates, and then translate that into a proper coding, exercise to see if they are the right fit. Yeah, so that's actually a lot of work, and sometimes when you do interview hundreds of candidates, ultimately sometimes they're not the right fit. It's really going back to, where you started off, right? And trying to understand this whole cycle again. So yeah.
I just find it very interesting because the whole insight that you have to interview the hiring manager first, like as a recruiter, before interviewing the candidates, like this is completely foreign to me, but it actually makes a lot of sense if you think about it. The fact that you had to ask him like specifically in this role, like what certain jargon that I should understand, could you explain it to me? And then you design like perhaps some sort of simplified case study that you could ask the candidate. That's quite a lot of work on you because like I couldn't imagine like say like the example that Saloni brought up, the Fibonacci exercise.
Yeah.
I would feel a bit stunted if I had to verbally ask that question also and then have to feel a bit lost when the candidate is like going through pseudocode line by line. And I cannot imagine like that kind of experience for you, like constantly having to learn new things, especially now in tech. You get more and more diversified roles now with like the AI buzz. Obviously, you have you have to know the difference between a data scientist and a data engineer. Now you have what's the difference between a prompt engineer versus like an AI engineer? There's so many things, and even we struggle to understand that.
Yeah.
So how has that process been for you, knowing that like, even something as simple as like simple to us only because we're in the field, full stack developer versus front end and back end. Honestly, like we get these questions a lot, but I still struggle to explain it to people. So how do you like try as a recruiter try to level up yourself with like the changes in the tech industry to try to understand this?
That's something that I thought through a lot. I think even before this
Yeah.
conversation, right? I did think about it as well. When we do recruit people of experience, actually, to be fair, we don't know exactly what this role look like, because if we're
Yeah.
talking about AI engineers versus a full stack developer, they are very different as well, right? The skill sets are different. You look at someone that may have perhaps data science experience, and there are some that doesn't have data science as well.
Yeah,
So
yeah.
I would say that we do break it down. We'll look at exactly what the scope of role looks like first, and we actually understand what are the skill sets, or rather the technical skill sets are required for this role before we get into it. But similarly now, because we have ChatGPT as one key tool that we use on a daily basis, if you look at that, sometimes we don't need someone that has all the experience, but what this person needs is a very good soft skill that actually understands what the business requirements are, and actually understands how they as a individual able to build a similar app or similar tool that could be useful for the business. So for instance, I think for our cases, I think a lot of the companies that I know as well, some of the companies that we invested in as well, they do have struggles as well finding the right fit of candidates. But what they need is someone that is intellectually, you know s- I would say they are very stimulated in their sense of understanding of what their role looks like and what this role may be, and they actually need to translate that in a way where if they don't have that skill set, they will go out there and actually look for resources to support them.
Right, so the
Yeah.
resourcefulness is something that you're looking for. So you're really looking more for like when I talk to this candidate, I might not understand a lot of the technical stuff they're saying, but their ability to even translate that to you to be able to pick up that
Correct.
you are a general recruiter. How am I going to translate this into the business requirements you're
Yes.
asking for? How am I going to like relay this? And I guess these are also things that we talk about a lot in our podcast as well, realizing that being a software engineer is not just being able to code, right? It's really understanding
Understand the product, be able to articulate as well. So I mean, I'm very happy to hear that.
Yes,
That's
yes.
like a important part of
Yeah.
at least your company's recruitment.
Yes,
And
correct.
it makes a lot of sense because like I am not venturing to understand every language in the world, but I pride myself in being like an engineer who, you can give me different syntaxes, but at the end of the day, I am very confident to be able to translate whatever the user needs in whatever syntax needed, because I understand design patterns. I understand like what companies, large or small scale, need. And I guess being able to explain that to you in a layman fashion that you can easily take away and translate it back to your hiring manager, yeah, is very useful to you.
Yeah,
And
correct.
this is really making me think of a lot, because I think a lot of our friends in the tech industry do spend, I would say they spend more time lead coding than actually practicing the soft skills, which I know you talk a lot about. But at the same time, it's very hard to explain what these soft skills are. I think that's why you emphasize a lot in doing mock interviews, like interview as much as you can, because it's only through talking to like people like yourself and other different recruiters that you keep practicing the skill of like, okay, I need to keep explaining this and explaining that.
Yeah, correct. So that's something that we do very often as well. There are times that we could possibly be reaching out to candidates who are not actively looking for a new role. So if you think about
that's
that,
true,
right?
yeah.
You're sitting at that position where this person is not looking, I'm reaching out, they tend to be more tense because you're not actually actively looking for a new role. So you actually need to first figure out what the intention is and how we can actually guide them and give them tips and tricks so that they can actually move on in their recruitment process, right? So typically as a talent acquisition person, we don't actually need to give them a lot of guiding tools as well. Right? What we can do is we give them resources online to say, hey, you can do this, read up on this. But as a recruiter, you would actually need to go extra mile to actually break down what this role looks like and how you should actually communicate that during an interview. Not saying that you have to change the way you speak, but rather be more in the way that it helps you to formalize how this role looks like and how you can actually contribute, because you only have, say, a 20 minutes or 30 minutes call with the hiring manager. So that 20 minutes, you need to encapsulate everything that you want to share based on this role and actually understand if this is a right match for you as well. And how do you actually provide that insight into how your role is. Sometimes, like I mentioned, we don't look at people that have the like to like of experience, but what we look at is the soft skill. How do you actually, build that experience, or do you do that outside of your day job as well, right? Like, do you build your own app? Do you do something outside of your norm? So things like that. We ask very good questions as well to stimulate them and allow them to actually showcase that during the interview. So that's something that I do notice, that candidates that comes in more prepared in that aspect, they do ace the interview much better than the ones that are not.
I think that's very interesting. I want to ask, like, we did talk about this in one of our other episodes where I was talking about how doing side projects are important. I want to know from like your perspective, like as me as a software developer, I do side projects. One of the reasons I do it is to stand out from the others, that I do not just code at work. I also code 5 to 9 after my 9 to 5, something like this.
Yes.
And also, of course, I'm interested in building something that can help in my day to day. But I wanted to know from your perspective, does that actually make a person stand out, that this person does side projects related to their work outside work? Or do you think that's not really necessary? They should also have a life, maybe?
Well, I think there's two sides of it, right? You can see that as one, you are actually spending a lot of time trying to build your skill set or hone your skills as well, right? But there are another side where you're spending so much time, where you're not focusing on your maybe work-life balance, or you're not focusing on your own life, right? I think there's a good side for that. If you do actually spend time doing your own projects, you do actually gain the advantage when you go for an interview, because what I would say generally what hiring managers are looking for are people that are proactive. They're not just, confined into what their daily tasks are, but they're someone who is curious minded, wants to venture out into something else, wants to build that entrepreneurial mindset in their role. But that really depends on the company as well. What I'm speaking about, it's based on my experience and some of my companies that we invested in. Yeah.
I guess because most of the companies under your belt are also startups at that stage. So
correct.
to look out for traits like proactiveness, resourcefulness is obviously like more relatively more important for a startup, because
Yes.
maybe the role requires them to be like more flexible, it's
Correct.
less like the dictative, like
Yes.
the role.
So it has to be very fluid if you were to be working in a startup. Whereas if you work in a huge corporate,
Yeah.
society, you probably would see that there's not a need where you need to be very specialized into multiple areas. Where I think a lot of times, if you were to work for a big corporate, they tend to look at very silo experiences, and they tend to
Right.
hire people like that because they like that part of that. Whereas for a startup, they want someone that is comfortable to dabble into multiple tools and projects.
Right,
And and even though they don't have that technical skill, they will want that person to actually build up their experience or their exposure into that space. So not necessarily you need to have it, but if you do side projects like that, it actually do showcase that you're someone that is very versatile. You're able to, wear multiple hats.
Oh, that's actually interesting because we did like the conversation about startups versus like larger corporations. Like, what's the difference? We talk about what's the difference working in there, but we've never talked about the difference from a recruiter's perspective when I recruit. But I guess going down to like the value sets you're looking at, it makes sense that in a startup you want somebody who is more diversified, is more proactive in trying different things. So when they talk about their side projects, you're looking out for things like you've tried this out and that out, different roles, different stacks and stuff like that, and that resourcefulness to like find different solutions will be important to like a startup. But perhaps, like, not saying that side projects aren't important for recruiting for larger companies, but in those side projects you might want to look at more like, I use this side project to dabble in this specific skill set. Would you say that?
Correct.
Yeah, so you're trying to elucidate different things, and it's not so much about the quantity of the side projects, right?
Correct.
It's about what did you take away from it. I
Correct.
imagine.
Yeah, and sometimes when we interview these candidates, we actually dive even deeper into why they decided to start this side project. So not necessarily about their day job sometimes. It's all about like what they do outside of their work as well, and figuring out why they do this and what is the whole idea about it. Like why do you start something like that, you know? So a lot of times we kind of see another angle from their perspective, and we do see whether or not they are a potential candidate that could be a good fit to the company, and as well as looking at whether or not if they are resilient enough to actually do multiple things, or even to work with, the senior stakeholders, right, within the firm, right? Because not necessarily sometimes you need to build everything within a day or two, but you actually do need to actually speak to your stakeholders and actually convince them what this whole idea is. So
Right.
we do tend to look at multiple angle, and also looking at how this would actually translate that during the interview as well. And we take all this information, we furnish this to our hiring managers to give them a whole report about what this candidate
Right.
could be their strengths, and what are some of the, probably not cons, but more of what are some of areas of development for them as well. So we do actually also take this to candidates sometimes, to actually show them like what are some areas that you might missed out during an interview that
Oh,
could
that's
be,
nice.
yeah, it could be
Yeah.
useful. Not necessarily all of them, because we do have like thousands of
Yeah,
candidates if
yeah.
you were to look at the process, right? But we do try to be intentional. If let's say we do have good feedbacks from the hiring managers, we do want to share that with the candidates as well, because I do understand that interviewing is very lengthy, so we want to make sure that they get the best out of it, and hopefully their next interview they will score really well, and hopefully they get a good role as well for
Yeah,
themselves.